Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this very special occasion where we have an opportunity to explore this great question: will science ever find God's fingerprints? My name is Shane Martin, and I'm a fourth-year Law and Health Science student here at Adelaide University. And I'm a member of Evangelical Students here at Adelaide University. Evangelical Students is the Christian student group who are hosting this public lecture. Evangelical Students aims to reach every uni student on North Terrace with the good news about Jesus Christ. We have about 150 members, and we run public talks and other engaging activities on campus every week of the academic year. On behalf of Evangelical Students, it's my privilege to welcome you here today, and we thank you for taking time out of your day to explore this topic. And our hope is that this will be a thought-provoking and engaging hour for you. Now, just a few things to point out before we get started. The first is that if you have a phone, please switch it to silent. The second is to draw your attention to the pieces of paper that you found as you sat down. Now, I'll tell you more about these forms at the conclusion of the hour, but you may find it helpful to use the blank side to jot down questions or notes during the talk. In a moment, I will introduce Professor John Lennox, but before I do that, let me explain how our time will run. Shortly, Professor Lennox will deliver his address, which will conclude before 2 p.m. At that point, there'll be an opportunity for those of us that need to leave on the hour to do so. However, we hope that you will be able to remain and join us for a Q&A where Professor Lennox will answer your questions. Now, the way to ask those questions is to send an SMS to the number which you can see printed on the bottom of these pieces of paper on the blank side. Now, you can use this number any time from now onwards to send in your questions. I know from the conversations that I have with my friends about science and God that this question that we are asking today, it's a big issue. It's a big issue for many people. What a privilege it is then to think this through together with Professor Lennox. Professor Lennox is a British mathematician, a philosopher of science, and a Christian apologist who is the Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford. He is a world-class speaker and has conducted public forums with high-profile atheists from around the globe. And he also happens to be a very pleasant and gracious human being. Would you please give Professor Lennox a warm Adelaide welcome? Thanks for joining us here today, Professor Lennox.
That's my pleasure, sir.
All right. So just a few questions to warm you up. I've talked about how you are a mathematician and how during your university years you studied maths. Mm-hmm. Now, I studied law and since year 12 have tried to stay as far away as possible from mathematics. Why would you want to study maths at university?
Oh, to try to stay as far away from law as possible. Actually, that's unfair because I think that mathematicians and lawyers have something very important in common. We're both interested in the analysis of argument. But why you'd want to study mathematics is, first of all, because you discover you're quite good at it. And it's tremendous fun. So I enjoyed it. And that's probably true of most of the students here, including you. You found law fun, or did you?
Sort of.
Yeah.
No. All right, so you studied maths at university. During your university years, did you ever commit a university prank?
I did just before I went to university to get revenge on a French teacher. a group of us one evening decided that what we'd do was to get an old, this was years ago, nearly 100 years ago, I suppose. And we got an old radio set that squeaked and whistled and so on, and we set it up squeaking and whistling, and we got a group of students or potential students to sit around a telephone. And we got someone who could imitate an American voice to phone this French teacher up and tell him he'd won a holiday in Hollywood. And he could get this holiday if he would sing for us, "It's a long, long way to Tipperary." And he did. So that was the one. I can't remember, I remember various pranks that happened while I was at Cambridge, but I suppose I wasn't clever enough. I mean, there were a group of chaps who discovered some workmen working on the road and digging it up and so on. So they went to the police station and they said to the police in Cambridge, there's a group of students pretending to be workmen digging up the road. They then rushed back to the workmen and said, there's a group of students dressed as policemen are going to come to you in a few minutes. And it created utter chaos. Now, don't let me give you any ideas.
Ladies and gentlemen, Professor John Lennox.
Well, he has the distinction of completely stumping me. I'd never been asked that question before. It's lovely to be with you, and I'd be very interested to know. Tell me, how many of you are science students? Hands up. Okay, hands down. How many of you would roughly call yourselves in the arts or humanities? So it's about half and half. And how many of you are in other fields? Okay, great. Because although I'm a kind of scientist, in Cambridge they give you a BA in mathematics and everything else, in fact. So I very much enjoy the arts side. And just to explain to you, I wanted to be a linguist when I was younger. My best subject was Latin. And then I wanted to be a modern linguist because I loved speaking French and German and so on. And then I changed to wanting to be an engineer, an electrical engineer, because I became a ham radio operator when I was 13. And then my headmaster said, look, you can get into Cambridge maybe if you do mathematics, because it's the only subject that we can teach that level. So I did mathematics. So I've enjoyed in life being interested in both the arts and the sciences. And I've been privileged to have a mentor and a friend who was a professor of Greek, so that he introduced me to the wonders of the classical world and the way in which the ancient Greeks thought about the big questions. And I was interested to discover that your motto at the University of Adelaide is to seek light. That's a wonderful aspiration. It rhymes very much with our motto at Oxford, which is Dominus illuminatio mea. That is, the Lord is my light. So seeking light and the idea of God being a light were at the foundation of Oxford University. So it was quite clear that the people that founded my university did not see any conflict between intellectual investigation and faith in God. It's our century that has created the fog that makes people think that there is some sort of conflict between intellectual activity in general and science in particular and faith in God. And the question I've been asked to address is, will science ever find God's fingerprints? The answer actually is science has already found them and depends crucially on them, which may surprise you. And the very first thing that shows us that there are fingerprints of intelligence in the universe is our own intelligence. You see, think about it. One of the famous articles that mathematicians love was written by Eugen Wigner in 1961. It's called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. I mean, think about it. Here's a mathematician and she's thinking in here about the universe out there. And she comes up with a set of equations or some sort of dynamical system, some sort of mathematical object that describes what's going on out there so accurately that by using her mathematics, he can make predictions about what's going to happen out there. Now, Wigner was a genius. He won the Nobel Prize. He was genius enough to realize that this is a vast mystery. How does that work? How can we reduce what's happening out there in our mind to a set of equations that are written in symbols? Einstein was the same. He was amazed, so amazed that he said the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. How can we understand it and write it down in mathematics? Now, there's a lot of interest in that question because, you see, we're doing our science with our minds. What is the mind? There's a very popular book in Holland at the moment that I came across recently, You Are Your Brain. And many of my colleagues who are of the atheist persuasion think that the mind is the brain. And if you ask them what the brain is, they'll tell you, roughly speaking, that the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process that didn't have it in mind. Well, that's extremely interesting. If you knew that your iPad, iPod, whatever it is, computer, Mac, and so on, was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? Of course not. So here we have the rather intriguing situation where some thinkers in our generation are suggesting that the thing you do science with is not trustworthy at all. I find that deeply unsatisfying. Because you see, what's happening there is that a logical argument based on a reductionist philosophy, reducing everything to physics and chemistry and ultimately to meaningless products of a blind universe, actually reduces and destroys rationality. Now, there are many people that have seen that. I was taught quantum physics by Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, and he points out in many of his books that this just can't work. If you reduce thought simply to physics and chemistry and to the firing of synapses, you'd never know that you were thinking, because it destroys rationality, it destroys meaning. So my first point is this, that the very fact that we can think rationally is a pointer that this universe is not all there is, that there is a supernature beyond nature, that there is an intelligence beyond this universe. Now, the interesting thing is this, that's not a new idea, it's a very ancient idea, but importantly for our discussion is, this is the key idea that gave rise to science in the modern sense. Alfred North Whitehead was a brilliant historian and philosopher of science, and he said, you know, in 1500, Europe knew less than Archimedes, who died in 212 BC. But by 1700, Newton's Principia Mathematica had been written, a work of utter genius. And he asked the question, what happened between 1500 and 1700 that led to this meteoric explosion in Europe, in the West, of interest in formulating the universe and understanding how it works in mathematical terms? His answer? It comes from the medieval insistence on the rationality of God as creator. Now, this is so fascinating to me, because from our vantage point in the 21st century, we have people like Stephen Jay Gould, the late Stephen Jay Gould, who's a brilliant science writer, who said, whatever we say of nature, there's no evidence, there are no fingerprints of God in nature. And yet the very science, the modern science which he espoused, started with people who did believe that they were thinking God's thoughts after him, to quote Johannes Kepler, the brilliant Prague mathematician. So it raises very interesting ideas. So one thing I want to get straight first is this, that historically, science developed In a way that was described by C.S. Lewis very succinctly, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. You see, far from science and belief in God being opposites, it was actually belief in a creator that was the motor that drove modern science. People believed there was a God, so they looked for his fingerprints. And one of the biggest ones was the one we don't realize because it's our own thinking process. It's our own rationality. It's our own capacity to do science. That is the most powerful evidence. Because you see, if you reduce your thinking by a cause and effect process simply to the laws of nature, wherever they came from, and natural processes, you destroy meaning. Now, the kind of argument that I'm referring to is much more familiar to you if I put it in another way. I come from Ireland, as some of you might recognize from my accent. And how often have people said to me, "Oh, you say that because you're an Irishman." Have you heard that kind of argument? Or you say that because you're a student, or you say that because you're a woman, or you say that because you're a man, and so on. Have you heard that kind of argument? But do you realize what the argument is doing? It is saying, because you're an Irishman, that is, we can give you a causal explanation that what you say has no meaning. Now that's very interesting. It's using causal explanation to empty your statement of meaning. Exactly the same thing happens on the philosophical level when you reduce thought to the firing of synapses in your brain. It empties anything you say of meaning. The way to get meaning, as the early pioneers of science saw, they believed there would be meaning to be found. And they could rationally describe the universe because they believed God had created it. So they started with faith in God. Isn't that interesting? And it was a rational faith. That is, it was based on evidence. And the more they discovered about the universe, the more they admired the way God had done this so brilliantly. So the first fact, it is a fact, because historians and philosophers of science these days are largely agreed about this, that there's a very intimate connection between faith in God in the biblical sense and the rise of modern science. So, have we found the fingerprints of God? The answer is yes. It's not a question of will we find them. We're using them all the time. Now that raises a whole lot of questions, as I very well know. And we could approach the rest of this, and I'm going to give you plenty of time for questions, in two different ways. I could start by talking to you about some of the results of science that indicate that there's more to it. And I'm going to mention one or two of those. Like, for instance, the fine-tuning of our universe. Now, you know about that on an informal level. If the sun were a little bit near to Earth, life as we know it would be impossible because of the heat. Seems to me that in summer here it's virtually impossible, which is why I'm here in winter. If the sun were too much further away, life would be impossible because of the cold. If Earth rotated ever so slightly faster, you'd get a free trip into space, but you wouldn't exist because there would be no atmosphere. If the Earth rotated a little bit slower, you'd freeze to death in the daytime freeze to death at nighttime and boil to death in the daytime. So it's just got to be right. And there are so many parameters that have got to be right, it's almost unbelievable. But when you get to the level of understanding the history of the universe from its commencement, it gets staggeringly fascinating. One of my colleagues, Sir Roger Penrose at Oxford, is arguably the most brilliant living mathematician. He has worked a great deal with Stephen Hawking, and he is not a theist. But in one of his books, he said, if you want to get a universe like this, with a second law of thermodynamics, which means informally that even your Rolls Royce will eventually rust. That is nature's running down. So if you want a universe like that, like this one, then he says the Creator's aim has to be accurate to 1 part in 10 to the power 10 to the power 43. That's more money than you've got in the bank. In fact, it's such a large number that if you put a 1 here and put a 0 on every elementary particle in the universe, you cannot write that number out to the base 10 because there are only about 10 to the power 70 elementary particles in the universe. And this is 10 to the 10 to the 123. It's staggeringly accurate. That's his calculation, not mine. And the interesting thing that over the past 50, 60 years, so many of these parameters that are finely tuned have been discovered that it has led to a huge question. One of the fundamental forces that Paul Davis, an Australian mathematician, colleague, brilliant writer, I've met him and had a debate with him several times. He just points out that the evidence for some kind of intelligence is overwhelming because he points out one ratio, I think it's of the electromagnetic force to gravity, has to be accurate to a far less degree than the number I've just quoted. But he said the accuracy is like this. Suppose you were aiming a gun and your target was 1 centimeter across and it was sitting at the far end of the observable universe. The chance of hitting that target is about 1 in 10 to the 60, which is the fine-tuning of this ratio. Now this is fascinating. This is science, discovery, mounting up and raising a big question. What does it mean? Because it very much looks as if, to quote another physicist who's not a believer in God, it almost looks as if the universe was expecting us. And Sir Fred Hoyle, who was one of my examiners at Cambridge, the famous cosmologist, he said it looks as if a super intellect has monkeyed with physics. And he was impressed, and I talked to him on one occasion about it, by this phenomenal fine-tuning. And it led Max Tegmark of Princeton, a brilliant physicist, to say, well, he said, looking at this, there's either a God or a multiverse. Well, he's wrong, actually, because God can create as many universes as he likes. God and the multiverse are not alternatives, of course. And it fascinates me. I was in a debate with one of Oxford's leading atheists, very nice chap, Professor Millikan, and he said, I hope in this debate tonight you're going to use your best argument. Oh, I said, please tell me what my best argument is. I'd love to hear from you, as you're an atheist. Oh, he said, I'll give you this for free. He said, your best argument is fine-tuning. He said, if ever anything was going to convince me that there was a God out there, it would be the fine-tuning in physics. So, of course, I used the argument. And he tried to oppose it bravely. But it was a very honest admission. It is a powerful argument. It's not the only argument. But it is a very powerful argument from the increasing knowledge we have of science that something is going on. Now, I actually believe that something that's going on is the fact that this is evidence of a creator. There is a God who is behind the universe. Now, once you say that, of course, you meet all kinds of objections. And I'm going to have a look at some of those objections for a moment. And I hope you're thinking of questions. Please listen with a view to asking questions and write them down when you think of them, because it'll be far more fun if you have formulated a carefully balanced, briefly worded question that we can look at afterwards, and then I'll be talking about things you're interested in rather than talking about things you're not interested in. So let's come back to this question, because we need to talk a little bit about the nature of explanation, because the constant pressure that you meet in university as students or as professors is, look, you've got to choose between God and science. I mean, God, all you're saying is, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. You're lazy. How many times have I been told I'm intellectually lazy? That's all you're saying. Yeah, you can't explain this, therefore God did it. Well, that's what I'm not saying. There are people who say that, and because they say that, they get into trouble. They believe in what's called a god of the gaps. You know, the ancient Greeks believed in a god of thunder. And then some of them went to Adelaide University after a few thousand years, and they studied atmospheric physics. And they gave up believing in the god of thunder, as most of you have, I presume, because you understand how thunder occurs, and you know about temperature gradients and pressures and electrical discharges and vibrations of sound and so on and so forth. So exit the god of thunder. And there are many people today that use that kind of argument to get rid of the God of the Bible. I had a debate, we have a God Squad debate at Oxford every year or two, and we all dress up in dinner jackets and so on, and it's a sort of parliamentary kind of debate. So there were 3 on my side and 3 on the other side. And Richard Dawkins came along, but he didn't want a debate, so he just peered at us from the opposition benches. And the major argument that was used staggered me. It was the editor of Skeptic magazine, Michael Shermer. He looked at me and he said, you know, you're an atheist with respect to Artemis, Baal. And he went through a long, boring list of ancient gods, ending up with Z for Zeus or Z for Zeus. And he said, you're an atheist with regard to all those gods. And I am, ladies and gentlemen. I am a convinced Zeusist, a convinced Wotanist, and a convinced Baalist. So he said, his final line was, we just go one God further. And we get rid of the God of the Bible. And that's it. So you should be like that. You should get rid of that God if you were consistent. Well, I thought, how interesting. He clearly knows nothing about the ancient Greek gods, Roman gods, Babylonian gods, and Assyrian gods. Because anybody that studied them will know that there is a profound difference between those gods. Werner Jaeger, brilliant Oxford professor, expert in ancient philosophy, makes this point. He said, the ancient gods have one thing in common. They are all products of the primeval state of the material universe. The God of the Bible created the universe. He wasn't a product of it. And to put him in the same category is total confusion. Most of those gods are actually gods of the gaps. They rightly disappear on the advance of science. Science has done a marvelous job in ridding the world of imaginary gods. Now, the question now boils down to, do we get rid of the one God who's the creator and sustainer of heaven and earth? And we come in a circle, right back to this fact historically, that God, belief in God, was the motor that drove science. Now, how did that happen? Firstly, because people didn't fall for the trick of confusing the God who created the universe with a God of the gaps. Stephen Hawking does that. He thinks, I believe in a God of the gaps. Now, I want you to understand this argument very clearly. If you think God is simply a God of the gaps, then you've got to choose between science and God, because that's how you've defined God. Do you see that? See, one of the biggest problems in the public debate today is not science, but it's the concept of God you're talking about. And since many of the leading thinkers believe that people like myself believe in a God of the gaps, they're trying to get rid of that and say you've got to choose between that and science. I agree with them entirely. But that's not the God I believe in. The God I believe in is not a God of the gaps. He's God of the whole show. The bits we don't understand and the bits we do. Now that's very important to bring us to the next thing. Because we are all aware that science explains. But what does science explain? I wasn't told at school that the law of gravity did not tell me what gravity was. Nobody knows what gravity is. Isaac Newton realized that his law of gravity was brilliant. Didn't tell him what gravity is. You see, often I hear, well, science has explained that. And I say, what do you mean by explain? Tell me what gravity is. Nobody knows, so it hasn't explained what it is. So even against its own background, we need to be a little bit more humble about what we think scientific explanation is. That's point one. Point two is, why is the kettle boiling? Well, you know why it's boiling, because energy from the lit gas is transmitted through the copper base of the kettle into the water molecules, which are agitated to such an extent some of them are beginning to fly off, and the pressure's built up and it's driving the whistle that tells me the kettle's boiling. Isn't that so? No, it isn't. It's boiling because I would like a cup of tea. I'm glad you laugh, because you see the difference between two kinds of explanation. Isn't that right? The first explanation is a scientific explanation. The second is what we call an agent explanation. And you see, we can knock this absurd idea that science and God are opposed by simply thinking about the difference between two kinds of explanation. God and science are no more opposed as explanations than Henry Ford is opposed to the law of internal combustion as an explanation for the motor car. I mean, I've never met a student or anybody at school from the second form up who would ever dream of thinking that Henry Ford and science of automobile engineering and the law of internal combustion were alternative and conflicting explanations of the existence of a motor car. And yet, some of the brightest minds in the world apparently cannot understand that God doesn't compete with science as explanation, because God is a different kind of explanation. Richard Dawkins says explicitly he's the same kind of explanation. And that is nonsense, actually, logical nonsense. So therefore, when Isaac Newton discovered his famous law of gravity, he didn't say, wonderful, I've got a law of gravity, I don't need God. No, he didn't. He wrote the book I mentioned, the most brilliant book in the history of science, hoping that people, as he wrote in the front of it, hoping that people would, as a result of reading it, believe in a God. You see, Newton was like the rest of us. The more you understand of engineering, the more you can admire the genius of a Rolls-Royce, not the less. The more you understand of art and painting, the more you can admire the genius of a Picasso, and not the less. And the more you understand of the universe, the more you can admire the genius of the God who did it that way, not the less. And yet we're constantly told with monotonous regularity that God and science compete as explanations. It's simply false. It's false to the nature of science, and it is false to the nature of God. Will science ever discover God's fingerprints? Now, fingerprints are fascinating things. I don't know whether you've ever studied them. But you are aware that you have unique fingerprints. Absolutely unique. You have other things that are unique, as in the iris recognition in your eye, and so on and so forth. And so criminal investigation uses fingerprints to identify people. Now, fingerprints don't tell you everything about a person, do they? I mean, you could study my fingerprints. You'd never get to know me very well. You might be able to pick me out of 1 billion people by having a computer analyze my fingerprints, and you'd know it was me, but that's full stop. But it's a good start. It at least gives you distinguishing features, because fingerprints contain information that is unique to you. It's information that can be recognized by automatic and robotic machinery. And it can compare your fingerprint with other fingerprints in a database so that you are identified by pre-programmed computer-automized machinery. And that brings us straight into our information age, doesn't it? You're all computer literate, far beyond me. I find if you've got a problem with a computer, ask a 7-year-old. And if he can't do it, ask a 5-year-old, and you'll probably get it done twice as fast. It is staggering how computer literate we are. Now, this is a fascinating thing, because you see, we've lived to see that life is not as simple as we used to think. Darwin thought of a warm little pond and life arising essentially spontaneously. That's been given up long ago, because we've discovered that in every single one of the 10 trillion cells in your body, there's a database that's bigger than most databases in the world. It's called, as you know, the DNA code, the human genome. Now, the human genome is a very interesting thing. It can teach us a lot of things. First of all, it can teach us that the real problem doesn't lie between science and God, because the first director of the Human Genome Project was James Watson, who won the Nobel Prize. And I met him once and was able to discuss his findings with him. He's an atheist, a very strong atheist. The second director of the Human Genome Project was the present director of the National Institute of Health in the United States. His name is Francis Collins. He's a Christian. They're both at the top of the scientific tree. So that should show you very clearly that the problem can't lie between science and God. Where the problem is, ladies and gentlemen, is it's a real conflict, but it's between two worldviews. It's between the worldview of theism, belief in God, and the worldview of naturalism, materialism, if you like, which is atheistic. That's where the conflict is. There are scientists on both sides. But the human genome can teach us a great deal more. Because, you see, we are given to understand often in our science lessons at school that the nature of explanation is always from the simple to the complex. We split water up into hydrogen and oxygen. We split salt into sodium chloride and so on. And we get used to this idea of taking a complex thing apart and studying the parts and trying to get some insight on the whole. We call that reductionism, methodological reductionism, and it's a habit of thought that you will develop. You probably have developed it already. When you hit a big problem in life of any kind, you tend to try to simplify it and see what aspects it has, solve the bits, and see if you can get insight on the whole. So that explanation then goes from the simple to the complex. And we all know of that very ancient notion of Democritus and Leucippus, the father of the atomic theory, that the basic ingredients of the universe are very simple. They're atoms and empty space. And that's all you've got, and that's all there is. And so the atoms falling through the empty space created galaxies and worlds, and in the end, life, and so on and so forth. That's the reductionist explanation. It's a bottom-up explanation. It's saying everything can be reduced to atoms and empty space. It's very ancient, but it's false. And what demonstrates it to be false, and you all know it to be false, is anything that involves language. Now, as you look up here, you see, meet Jesus at uni. You all understand that, don't you? Perhaps you don't quite yet understand what it means, which is why the Evangelical Union have arranged a series of fascinating lectures coming up next week. But you can understand the words. Now that's a fascinating process, because after all, what you're looking at there are just marks on paper, aren't they? M-E-E-T. You can make the strokes and the marks, but how is it you understand them? Well, of course you know, because you separately, independently of this particular notice, you've learned the English language. But now, as you look at that, the instant thing you perceive is that intelligence has been involved in producing it. Isn't that so? Immediately. Now, that poster probably was produced in an automatic printing machine. There may be all kinds of automatic and therefore blind processes working to produce it, but you know that behind it intelligence is operating, don't you? Because you can understand it. Now, here's the interesting thing. I meet many scientists in my life, and they recognize this immediately. And I have many discussions with them. And there was one particular scientist, and I'm going to tell you his story before we go into the question time. And at dinner at night in my college, he rather embarrassingly told me he was bored by mathematics. And he was an atheist and a reductionist, and we'd nothing to talk about, and we were going to have a miserable dinner, which is not a very nice way to start dinner. So I said, I'm a reductionist too, of a kind. And I explained to him what I've just explained to you. But he said, no, everything comes down to physics and chemistry. So I said, right, let's do an experiment. He said, what, at the dinner table? I said, sure, this is Oxford. So I picked up the menu, which said roast chicken, R-O-A-S-T, it's 5 letters. So he said, what's the problem? I said, for me, none. But I said, have a go at this. You think everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry? Yes, he said. Okay, I said. You explain to me the semiotics of those letters, how those marks convey to you the idea of roast. You explain that to me in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And his wife, who was a brave soul, she rather too loudly said, get out of that if you can. He didn't try. Do you know what he said? He said, for 40 years I've gone into my lab in Oxford thinking that could be done. I was staggered. I said, half a minute. I tried to play devil's advocate, which can be very easy for an Irishman, you know. And I said, but physics and chemistry have only been going for 500 or 600 years. He said, it doesn't matter. It's not within the power of physics and chemistry to explain the intelligent informational input that is indicated by those letters carrying meaning. That's fascinating, isn't it? He recognized that from a 5-letter word. I then asked him about DNA. 3.5 billion letters. Exactly in the right order. And what's the origin of that? Oh, chance and the laws of nature. Really? There's something going on, isn't there? Where we can look at 5 letters and instantly infer intelligent involvement, even though many processes may have been involved. And turn around and see the longest word that's ever been discovered and ascribe it to chance and the laws of nature. Why do people do that? Well, I know why they do it. They don't do it because that's a scientifically credible explanation. They do it because if you raise the alternative, you're raising the God question. It's the most powerful fingerprint that God has put in us, in every one of us. It's more than a fingerprint. It contains the information, at least part of it, that produces you. And it points upwards. Whatever processes, natural processes were involved in it coming together, its word-like character, its program-like character point to an intelligent input, which is why, ladies and gentlemen, I have no hesitation in saying that when I compare the two worldviews, the one that starts with atoms and the void and ends up with mind as a product of atoms and the void, and the view that says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him. And without him, nothing came to be that came to be. In the beginning was the Word. Fascinating. Greek word logos for word means information, code, command, all this kind of thing. That's fascinating. Because many people, you see, in my generation and yours, think the Bible has nothing to say to a contemporary age. Yet, how did it get this right? When the Bible's talking about creation, its simplest language form is, and God said, let there be light. And God said, and God said, and God said. It's a speech act. It's word creating mass energy. In the beginning was the Word, as John sums up what Genesis has had to say. This is brilliant stuff. Because the Bible is putting its finger as the central issue in the creation of the universe and us on the information question. It's as bang up to date as it could possibly be. And that's one of the major things, ladies and gentlemen, that convinces me we've already found the fingerprints of God. But there's such enormous pressure to reject what we can clearly see. Isn't it Richard Dawkins who wrote a book saying, it's terribly, terribly, terribly tempting to think the universe has been designed, and then to say, but it's only been apparently designed. I think it's terribly tempting to think it's designed because it has been designed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lennox. We look forward to hearing from you more as you answer questions that you guys have sent in. Now remember, it's not too late to send in your questions via that phone number that's on the bottom of those pieces of paper. Do send those questions in. Look forward to hearing them answered by Professor John Lennox after this. Now, in a moment, I'll give you the option to leave before the Q&A, but before I do that, let me draw your attention once more to these forms that were left on your seat. If you take them out now, on one side of the page, you'll be able to see that there's information about Jesus Week. Jesus Week is what Evangelical Students are running next week. Jesus Week is a debate and a series of talks that will be happening next week, all centered around the theme, Your God. Now, as you can see, our debate topic this year is your God dead? And we will be joined by the president of the Atheist Society of South Australia. Other talks that we are running during the week include on Tuesday, what does your God say about beer and sex? And on Thursday, is your God the only one? Particularly, if you are a university student here, you may have already noticed some of those bright blue jumpers being worn around campus. That's because we would like to invite you to all of these talks next week. They'll be happening at Union Cinema at 1 p.m. every day, and we would love to see you there. Now, also on the bottom of this same page, you can see that there's an opportunity for you to respond. We would love your comments about this event so that we can improve them in the future. Particularly, I want to draw your attention to the 4 checkboxes that are there. The first box, if you'd like to find out more about ES, you can tick that. ES stands for Evangelical Students, the student Christian group that is hosting this event. The second box is about other events coming up that are related to God and science. You can tick this if you would like to explore this issue further. We're running various events in the next week to do with this, such as a panel involving some Christian scientists that will be discussing this issue. There will also be a book club that will be running, which will be going through John Lennox's books in a group and allow you to explore these issues in a much smaller and intimate group. Now, the third box is if you are intrigued by what Professor John Lennox talked about in regards to the God that he talked about, to the God of the Bible. If you would like to find out more about this God, please tick that third box so that we can contact you and work out a way that works best for you to explore that further. Now, these responses are not just for university students, and so anyone here can tick these and then leave your contact details in the space provided. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that now.